Good afternoon and welcome to this side event. My name is Julie Teng and I'm the Global Coordinator for the Scaling Up Climate Ambition in Land Use and Agriculture through, and this is a NAPS, or SCALA in short, at UNDP. And it's a pleasure for me to host this event together with our partners, FAO, who are co-implementing the program, and I'll be moderating with Julia Wolf, who's the Deputy Lead for the FAO Climate Change team and who's the Global Coordinator for SCALA on the FAO side. We're also glad to have our donor at this event, represented by Dr. Ulf Jäkel from the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Climate Action, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety, or BMUKN in short, and BMUKN from Germany through the International Climate Initiative has supported the FAO UNDP SCALA program since 2020, and last year generously extended their support into 2028. And we're really grateful for this continuous collaboration and for you being here today, Dr. Jäkel. So while we're hosting this side event, as you all know, the COP30 is happening and adaptation has been very central to the discussions, with the presidency really placing adaptation at the core of climate action. We're very close to a decision on that, hopefully, and this has really been pushed by the presidency, and all parties have been eagerly waiting for this for the past 3 COPs, and that's one thing that at least they're all definitely agreeing on. And a lot of emphasis in those discussions has been placed on the implementation of NAPS and what is needed for this to happen. But only about half of developing countries have submitted so far. And this report that we're presenting today on the NAPS that have been submitted until June this year, as well as the discussions that will take place during this event, will be really relevant for both the formulation and implementation of national adaptation plans and other adaptation plans. So for the participants who are joining us on Maloka, as we're hosting this both on Zoom and Maloka, you should see a small live stream screen in the top left corner of your screen. And I invite you to click on that window to view the event in full screen. And with that, I will now give the floor to my colleague, Julia Wolf.
Thank you so much, Julie, for this nice introduction and placing it as part of the COP30 exchanges. My name is Julia Wolf, and thanks for introducing me, Julie. I just came back from COP30 with some other participants here in the room, and I confirm that adaptation is really high on the agenda. As a matter of fact, it is quite a crucial topic because a lot of the adaptation negotiation items like NAPS and Global Goal on Adaptation are still pending, and the presidency now needs to conclude it with the negotiators. And one of the key aspects is actually adaptation finance, which is in theory negotiated under the climate finance stream, but is also part of the means of implementation, which is coming up in under NAPS and GGA, which stands for capacity building, technology transfer, and finance. So it does matter a lot, and G77, the LDCs, the African groups, and all the others, they're pressing hard for it, obviously. So we wanted to make this side event today as really showing evidence how important it is, and also shifting the discussion from an ambition to an implementation discussion, where we have done so much already over the last years, and since the Paris Agreement implementation actually started in 2020 with the support of Germany, IKI, and the Ministry of Environment. As Julie said, we are also very proud to share a brand new report, the NAP Global Analysis, building on an FAO methodology we had developed for the National Determined Contributions, the NDCs. And then through SCALA, we partnered with UNDP to really delve deep into the 64 developing countries' NAPs and look at them to have some key findings from the analysis to look at really what countries are saying with regards to agri-food systems as components of their national adaptation plans, which per se are cross-sector. No? So today we also are really proud and to share some of the really relevant country experience, because this is what matters in the end, that implementation is happening and sufficient support is provided. So with that, I'm actually very, very pleased to soon hand over to Ulf Jeckel, who is the head of the European International Adaptation Climate Change Division in the Ministry of Environment, BMUKN in short. And then we'll have a framing presentation from Crystal Kröppler, who was the lead author of the global NAP analysis, and she will walk us through some of these key new findings and observations. And then we'll have a Q&A session where you can place some questions. And then we also have a panel discussion from bringing in country voices, which are really essential, moving from planning to implementation NAPs, which is already happening, but will be a really strong emphasis in 2026 forward. So we have Dr. Ismael Cohn from the Côte d'Ivoire and Mr. Jorge Guterres from Colombia. And so thanks so much for the country representatives to take time and really guide the discussion in terms of how to make a difference at the national level, which is really the key next step after all the ambitions that have been voiced in the context of COP30. So without further ado, I will hand over to Ulf Jeckel. Please, the floor is yours, Ulf.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you very much, Julie. And good morning to you colleagues in Belém. Good afternoon. Good evening to the colleagues in other parts of the world. It's a great pleasure for me to give some opening remarks for the side event on advancing climate action agri-food systems through national adaptation plans, which is organized by UNDP and FAO under the SCALA program funded by ICI. And first, let me express my sincere gratitude for the very good collaboration we have in the frame of this SCALA program. So with FAO and UNDP, and also with all the partners in the 12 countries. This is really, really great and a very good example for international cooperation in this regard. We all know agriculture stands at the heart of the climate challenge and also the climate solutions. Agriculture feeds the world, supports billions of livelihoods, and is among the most vulnerable sectors to the effects of a warming planet. And we have more than one report telling a clear story. The UNEP emissions gap report, for example, warns that we are heading towards 2.4 degrees Celsius of warming, a level which would bring severe heat, drought, and water stress to many crop regions and, of course, livelihoods, and therefore endangering our food supply. And the Adaptation Gap Report 2025 shows that developing countries need over 300 billion a year for adaptation. Yet the current finance is just a very small part of that. So we have to speed up there and enhance our things. The Global Tipping Points report highlights that shifting rainfall, soil degradation, and ecosystem loss could push food systems past critical thresholds. But it also points to positive tipping points where sustainable practices, innovation, and regenerative farming can trigger sustainable transformation. And the State of Climate Action 2025 makes it pretty clear and plain agriculture and land use are not on track. So we have to reduce deforestation, restore soils, and expand climate-smart farming much faster. So the task is pretty clear. We have to integrate adaptation into policies even more, in particular agricultural planning and investment. We have to scale up finance and technology for farmers, and especially smallholder, and empower local action and nature-based solutions that build resilience from the ground up. In other words, we need national adaptation plans and, of course, their effective implementation. The national adaptation plans have to be robust in design and feasible in financing and implementation. There are newly updated NAP technical guidelines launched in August 2025 by the Least Developed Countries Expert Group, LEG, which integrate latest science, global goal on adaptation, emphasize transition from planning to implementation. And these guidelines state very clearly that national adaptation plans need to follow a whole of society approach, be science-based, finance-ready, of course, and iterative. And for agriculture, the integration of climate adaptation is crucial. Topics such as soil health, crop diversity, ecosystem services, including pollination or water availability, as well as livelihood assessments, need to be embedded into planning and implementation. Yes, we have done some steps in our country. Let me mention a very few. We had the Federal Climate Adaptation Act entered into force in July last year, providing the first binding legal framework for adaptation across federal, state, and municipal levels. And under this law, the federal government has adopted the new German strategy for adaptation to climate change in end of 2024, which sets measurable targets and requires adaptation strategies on subnational and local level, with the aim that there is no blank spot without any adaptation strategy or plan in Germany. These processes on adaptation are anchored in law. This is strengthened emphasis on ecosystems, landscape level resilience, and biodiversity. Is also referenced in our Germany's updated biodiversity strategy. And internationally, we are, since 2010, when the NAP process under UNFCCC was launched, the ICI has supported 34 countries by providing more than 145 million euros for both NAP formulation as well as implementation. And ICI is financing a broad range of different national adaptation plan projects. Bottom-up community-based adaptation, sector-specific implementation of sectoral national adaptation plans, and so on and so forth. We financed, and one of the priorities is the ecosystem-based adaptation. Our ICI has financed over 70 EBA projects with a financial volume of around 420 million euros. To the SCALA program. SCALA is one of our flagship programs, that's for sure. Not only because 12 countries and 2 international organizations, UN organizations are involved, it's also a great example of how synergies between climate mitigation, adaptation, and in particular, since it's top up in 2024 with a stronger focus as well, biodiversity can be leveraged to achieve meaningful transformation of agri-food systems by working with countries on their national adaptation plan, their NDCs, and also their NB subs. There, SCALA is very well placed to respond to many of the issues mentioned in the climate reports and that are being discussed at COP30. The need to enhance ambition in NDCs and to have robust NAPs formulated, the need to scale up adaptation action, including through transformational adaptation, the need to address the interconnected crisis of nature loss and climate change, and the need to scale up financial support to do so. Julia has mentioned that as well, and that was the biggest topic when I was in Belém last week, and still is. And there are some initiatives going on. It's also about coordination. It's also about making it more visible, the need to do that, but it's also about triggering or to leveraging private investment, which we also have in mind when we do the SCALA project. So, and in some areas, private companies are already involved, which is a very good sign. Last year, around this time, we were proud to announce, and Julia has mentioned that as well, announce other 6 million euros funding for SCALA and an extension until 2028, which is good. The new phase of SCALA foresees a stronger focus on aligning climate and biodiversity and NDCs, NEPs, and NB subs. Yes, you know, this cannot happen every year, unfortunately, but we are committed that we continue our cooperation, and we are very much willing to do so. And once again, thank you very much for this very good cooperation we have. The way forward is clearly aligning national climate plans and action with national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And we are committed to work with you, with the 12 countries, with the 2 organizations, the next years in doing so. So, having said that, I'm very much looking forward to the event today. And with that, I give over to you, Julie or Julia, one of you.
Well, I
Julie,
will
maybe?
quickly conclude.
Thank
Thanks
you
so
very
much. Wonderful. Thanks so much, Ulf. This has been a fantastic introduction, and you pointed so well, and thanks for your appreciation of Scala and also Scala's next phase to really looking at the nexus between NDC NAPS and NV subs, which was in all the rooms, right? It's like this is really the convening power of Brazil we all saw and made a big difference from the Baku COP into this green everything, no? A COP which under Brazilians' leadership, which has made it very clear. And I think your ministry has been also a role model, really bringing in the biodiversity and the nature-based solution dimension to it, which really will move forward, I guess, in the implementation, not only at the conceptual level, but actually making a difference on the ground. And I'm sure our country speakers also will refer to it, how important it is to look at climate change and biodiversity together from a local action point of view. I'm also grateful that you bring in the science. No, you started talking about the tipping points and the IPCC guidance, which is in some cases also under threat, no, in the political room. So we also need to keep it really high up as a key instrument that IPCC provides to guide all our work, and it is science-based and informs the decision-making on the ground. And last, I'm grateful that you point to the German adaptation strategy, because it is really crucial. And I also think we should do that more in Scala forthcoming, to really have this exchange between, to say it in the negotiation language, between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1. So between developed and developing countries, to say, okay, what do you have in the agriculture, in the adaptation strategy in your country? And actually, Germany, as you pointed, has a lot of food and agriculture indicators, despite it not being the agriculture's economy, right? So there are really great examples to learn from, and also to see how it's embedded in the institutions, and how is the reporting working for Germany. So maybe we can bring you in other occasions on that as well. So thanks so much. And here, unfortunately, I have to apologize, because last night I was asked to stand in for my director at the Baku high-level dialogue today on adaptation, which starts in 10 minutes. So I have to leave you. I will look at the recording, and I'm grateful to hand over to Sybil Nelson, who will continue anyway as a co-chair and co-lead on Scala, but also today to replace me. Thank you so much. And I may come back later when my other session is over. Thank you, and over to Sybil.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm part of the Scala team, and it's my pleasure now to take over this portion of the moderation. And I have the opportunity now to introduce Crystal Crumpler. Crystal is a Natural Resources Officer at FAO, and also our focal point on NDCs and NAPS at FAO. Crystal was the lead author of the report that we've been mentioning and that she'll be presenting. And so I'm going to hand over now to Crystal to present this NAP analysis on behalf of the FAO UNDP research team. Crystal, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sybil. And thanks, Melanie, for sharing the slides. I am presenting on behalf of a very large team of technical experts across FAO and UNDP. So just want to start off by thanking all of them for their contribution to this. I will begin, next slide, Melanie. Just an overview of the purpose and the audience behind this report. So we initiated this analysis with 3 main aims in mind. Firstly, to examine kind of the coverage of agri-food systems and NAPS, to take stock of what our country's adaptation priorities and needs in the sector. Secondly, we were hoping that this document would serve as a reference for guiding evidence-based adaptation programs, projects, and investments. by highlighting what are the adaptation planning progress is being seen, the gaps, and by providing actionable insights onto how to strengthen the integration of agri-food systems into NAPs going forward. And thirdly, our hope is that it will provide insights onto the status and the relevance of agri-food systems in national adaptation planning to inform larger global climate change agenda processes, right, within the UNFCCC. Things like the NAP negotiations, the LEG activities, and the stocktake of adaptation progress under the Enhanced Transparency Framework in 2028. So with that in mind, there are three main target audience groups. National government stakeholders, of course, this includes policymakers and technical teams in ministries of agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and the like, who are directly engaged in the formulation and implementation of NAPs. Secondly, adaptation practitioners and development partners. So this encompasses technical agencies, international organizations, financial institutions, all of those that have a stake in providing the essential support and expertise needed for adaptation. And lastly, climate and agri-food negotiators and those in that space, right? Next slide. So just a moment to start with the methodology. So this report is based on 62 NAPs and 19 sectoral NAPs, which represent 64 developing countries as of mid-June this year. The scope or kind of the coverage of the analysis is focused really on the agri-food system component of the NAP. And to do that, we adopted a conceptual framework based on FAO and IPCC taxonomy that accounts for the interconnectedness of agri-food systems and adaptation, right? Within this framework, agri-food systems are broad. They encompass the entire value chain from production of crops, livestock, forests, fisheries, and aquaculture to the post-harvest side of agri-food systems and the actors involved in every stage or node of that value chain, right? An agri-food system lens also accounts for supporting systems that provide essential services to agri-food systems. So these include ecosystems and biodiversity that provide those essential services like soil formation and water regulation, as well as the human and socioeconomic systems that are underpinning agri-food systems and are so important for their function, right? That's things like health, livelihoods, infrastructure. And so our analysis accounts for this wide understanding of agri-food systems. And the research questions were designed in a way that looked at the different elements of the adaptation planning cycle from risk identification all the way to monitoring and evaluation. And lastly, took a comprehensive coverage of the agri-food, covering all subsectors, value chains, and actors, right? Now, the method is available online where you can take a look at further detail on the way in which we went about the data extraction and analysis phase. Next slide, please. So I've structured the presentation around the findings section of the report, starting with climate risks and impacts, because effective adaptation planning does require an understanding, right, of how climate hazards, vulnerability, and exposure interact to generate climate risk. And adaptations are most effective when they're informed by robust climate risk and vulnerability assessment. So in this section is where we look at that kind of evidence base. Next slide. So one of the main findings is that agri-food systems is on the front lines of climate change. Of course, that's no surprise. 95% of the NAPs are reporting climate-related impacts on agri-food systems, and this rises to 97% when the cascading consequences on food security are also considered. You'll see on the right in the figure a detailed kind of outline of the major climate impacts and risks reported. The most frequently are in the crop sectors, followed by livestock and grassland and forests. Fewer impacts are reported, but still quite a lot, over 50%, in ocean-based and inland fisheries systems and the post-harvest side of the food system. The most, reported impacts, these include declining crop yields and productivity, degradation of soil and water resources, higher incidence of pest and disease, and so forth. And the report documents all of that. Next slide. Similarly, the analysis shows that climate impacts are increasingly putting pressure on those ecosystems and biodiversity that provide such essential services to the functioning of food and agriculture. These include mainly freshwater ecosystems and water resources, terrestrial ecosystems, ocean and coastal ecosystems, as well as special ecosystems like wetlands. Now we looked at impacts for each ecosystem, and the figure on the right shows the freshwater ecosystem. I won't show all figures for all ecosystems, it's just illustrative. But the impacts we looked at are on 3 levels, right? So the biome level, the species level, and the ecosystem service level. We find that the majority of impacts are at the species and the ecosystem level being reported. These in freshwater ecosystems are things like changes in hydrological flows, declining water quality and availability, shifts in forest distribution, and increase in soil degradation. That's for all ecosystems combined. Again, I won't show the other ecosystems, but it's in the report. Next slide, please. So another striking finding emerging from this analysis is that nearly all countries, 98%, are reporting climate-related impacts on those human and socioeconomic dimensions that are so closely tied to agri-food systems. And this is telling us that climate-driven stresses and shocks are not only threatening ecosystems and production, but also driving adverse downstream impacts on health, on human being, on food security outcomes, and the like. Here you see the systems that are most frequently where the most frequently impacts are reported. Health and well-being, food security, livelihoods, and inequality and poverty reduction being inhibited due to climate change. Next slide, please. So, and beyond just looking at the content of the NAP, we also tried to evaluate the climate science basis underpinning adaptation planning, and we found that there are some persistent gaps in the application of evidence-based tools to understand climate risks in agri-food systems. And you see in the figure on the right that, while all countries are reporting the use of climate projections, for example, only 58% are using the best available multi-model data. Less than half are relying upon regionally downscaled climate models. A third of countries are applying climate risk and vulnerability assessments for agri-food systems, which is quite low because it's such an important start for evidence-based adaptation option identification. And around 17% are using climate impact-based models for agri-food systems. So what this is showing us is that there is a need for greater emphasis on the enhanced climate base for making sure that the adaptation options being prioritized at a later stage when we get to project development and interventions, that they're designed to be appropriate and fit, right? Encouragingly, we do see that many countries are promoting improvements in their climate information services for agri-food systems as a huge priority, 81% of countries. Next slide, please. So in this section, the leg tells us that prioritization and option appraisal are essential steps in the NAP process. And so in this section, in the next slide, I can't unfortunately dive into all of the details. Next slide, please. Are the priority systems and the adaptation actions being included in the NAPs as statements of priority for investment and action? And the main finding from this chapter is that adaptation in agri-food systems is a universal priority across all developing country NAPs. You see here just a snapshot of the priority subsectors within agri-food systems. The most and the least around, energy efficiency improvements or, rural access to energy within rural households and communities, but more so in crops and forests and livestock. The table here shows it's a snapshot of the typology of adaptation actions, in this case in the crop sector, but the report includes this for each subsector. And overall, the most frequently promoted adaptation options in agri-food systems are things like climate-tolerant crops and varieties, afforestation, and many measures related to sustainable water use, water harvesting, and the like. There is a notably lower focus on improved livestock management or kind of systems-based approaches like food loss reduction around the value chain, climate resilient food storage, and the reuse of agricultural wastes for organic inputs or energy. We also see a variation of adaptation priorities across regions that are often linked to the predominant production system, so irrigated rice in Asia or pastoral systems in Africa. Next slide, please. Similarly, the inclusion of ecosystems and biodiversity are priority areas for adaptation. And you see here the freshwater and water is the most frequently prioritized ecosystem and natural resource. And not to say that the other ecosystems are not equally important. The thing to note here is that the majority of option or actions are focused on management and conservation, and less so on restoration, likely due to challenges related to the capacity to restore an ecosystem to its previous state, right? Next slide, please. Here we see that the human and socioeconomic dimensions of agri-food systems are critical priorities for adaptation. This includes health and well-being services within rural areas, critical infrastructure linking to markets, livelihood and poverty alleviation, and food security focused adaptation. The most frequently actions here are improved cultivars, agricultural insurance, and wash services, whereas there are some significant gaps, I guess, in addressing the socioeconomic vulnerabilities in agri-food systems through measures like addressing human mobility, addressing land and water tenure, or even the use of programs like social protection. Next slide, please. So again, taking a somewhat more critical look at the NAPs, the analysis does demonstrate this kind of limited alignment between the major climate-related hazards and impacts being reported and the adaptation actions being planned. And this is highlighting what the analysis is showing as a critical gap in evidence-based planning. So here we see that only 16% of adaptation actions in agri-food systems are explicitly linked to climate-related hazards or impacts reported. And in the next slide, we see the limited use of adaptation appraisal and prioritization methods to make sure that adaptation actions are context specific, right? So, around, I think 45%, yes, are using robust adaptation option and appraisal methods, things like multi-criteria analysis or cost-benefit analysis. And this may be leading to that disconnect between the context specificity of some of the adaptation options. Now, will be important when we move from planning to implementation, right? To make sure that those options are more tailored. At the moment, only 16% are linked to climate hazards, and only 14% are explicitly targeting socioeconomic vulnerabilities or vulnerable groups in agri-food systems. Next slide, please. So in this section, we looked at how countries are demonstrating readiness for implementation from an agri-food lens. Next slide. I'm trying to rush. So the leg advises that there are 3 key elements of institutional readiness for action. This entails institutional mandates and coordination. We see that while not often leading the NAP, ministries of agriculture or relevant ministries do play a key role in NAP implementation. Around 41% of countries have established multi-sectoral coordination mechanisms that include the Ministry of Ag, so there's some room for improvement there. The second pillar is around policy mainstreaming. So 3/4 of countries are outlining planned or ongoing efforts to mainstream agri-food adaptation into policies and plans. And thirdly, countries see stakeholder engagement as a cornerstone for effective NAP implementation. This speaks to the whole of governance concept mentioned earlier, where 91% of countries are acknowledging the role of different actors for implementation of agri-food adaptation in their NAPs, from national to subnational government, civil society, and the like. However, while there is progress in adaptation planning, around 45% are still facing significant barriers in moving to implementation, specifically in agri-food systems, and the report details some of those barriers. Next slide, please. So adaptation finance. So there is a striking mismatch between the amount of adaptation finance needed in agri-food systems as estimated in the NAPs, which is 55% of total, compared to the flow. So at the moment, agri-food systems are receiving less than 20% or 20% of global adaptation finance. And this overall amounts to 1% of total climate finance. Next slide, please. There's a component in the report on private sector engagement that I'll skip here, but the point is that private sector is seen as a priority actor. There are multiple barriers to engagement. Only 11% of countries have de-risking instruments in place for agri-food systems, and a large share of countries are prioritizing the need for private sector investment strategies for adaptation. Next slide, please.
Crystal, we have about a little less than 10 minutes left for you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. I was rushing, but I have more time. Okay. A central element of advancing adaptation is the ability to track progress on implementation, right? And the leg emphasizes that NAP should include robust MEL systems, monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems, which enable countries to measure progress, identify gaps, and adjust strategies over time, right? And so this section examines how countries are establishing MEL systems and how they're connected to tracking progress in agri-food systems, and what kind of insights we can draw from that in terms of the ability to report against the global goal in adaptation. Next slide, please. So within the NAPs, nearly all countries are referencing monitoring and evaluation and learning systems, but there seems to be a gap in the operationalization of these systems. Only 34% identify MEL systems that are operational. And on the right, you see different elements of MEL systems, where a very small fraction are touching upon that learning component of MEL, which is so important to make sure that governments are able to iteratively adjust their adaptation strategies over time, right? As opposed to just MEL being a compliance activity. Below in the figure, you see the percent of countries that have already identified adaptation indicators for tracking adaptation in agri-food systems, 47%, which is quite encouraging. At the same time, around a quarter have quantified and time-bound targets for tracking progress, which is, you know, the key benchmark for tracking progress over time. Next slide, please. Here we see that it's encouraging to see the amount of indicators already formulated for tracking adaptation in agri-food systems, but if you dig a little deeper, there is some imbalance, right, in scope and effect and potential effectiveness, right? So on the right-hand side, you see the majority of indicators are focused on production over the supply and distribution side of the agri-food value chain, and less so are less tailored to track food security outcomes. Similarly, in the figure below, it's a distribution of the different indicators and how what function they have, right? So there's an overwhelming focus on kind of short-term outputs and processes of adaptation, which are easier to track, right? Because that's number of seeds disseminated, number of plans developed. But that takes 74% of the indicators. Whereas the remaining fraction, when it comes to understanding how effective is adaptation in reducing vulnerability and strengthening adaptive capacity and resilience in the form of adaptation outcomes and impacts, the indicators or the metrics available aren't quite there, right, in terms of overall coverage. Overall, 18% of indicators track outcomes and only 7 are tracking impacts. This may limit the ability to know how effective adaptation is. Next slide. Now, we did a quick mapping of how the indicators line up against the GGA targets to see if there's alignment, right? And it's interesting to see how cross-cutting agri-food systems are, because we see clear alignment, obviously, with GGA Target 9B on food and agriculture, but also very strong alignment with other GGA targets, particularly on ecosystems and biodiversity and water. Weakest alignment, and likely because of the lack of metrics being formulated and included in the NAPs around things like poverty, health, and cultural heritage. Next slide, please. So in this section, we examined how countries are outlining and addressing the specific priorities and needs and the rights of vulnerable populations and marginalized groups in agri-food systems throughout the NAP process. Next slide. And one element, of course, is multi-stakeholder engagement and ensuring whole of society approaches in NAP formulation. And that was a clear priority in NAPs, and there was evidence that that was conducted. At the same time, while, you know, agri-food systems are, you know, are true climate risk hotspots, 97% of countries identify them as hotspots, but there is somehow limited alignment between the identification of vulnerable groups and that large number of countries that have identified risks in agri-food systems, right? Out of all population groups, around half of countries are identifying the specific vulnerability of agri-food system populations. This may stem from, remember, the limited use of climate risk and vulnerability assessment, and the limited use of gender analysis for formulation of the NAPs, at least as what was stated. Next slide, please. So encouragingly, the principle of gender equality and social inclusion is widely recognized in the NAPs, but deeper integration is somehow limited. We see strengths, a good number of NAPs are exhibiting adaptation options that are prioritizing the promotion of local and indigenous knowledge, the inclusive adoption of different practices and technologies in agri-food systems. But as mentioned earlier, there is a gap when it comes to addressing underlying inequalities in agri-food systems amongst vulnerable and marginalized groups through mechanisms like social protection, inclusive economic programs, addressing tenure, and these sorts of inequalities within agri-food systems. And overall, the number of actions out of total agri-food actions that do use or adopt this gender equality, social inclusion-based approach represent only 3% of total actions for agri-food systems. So there's some room for improvement, right, when we move to implementation. Next slide, please. The consequence of that is that few adaptation actions are tailored to the specific vulnerable populations in agri-food systems. So while, 97% of countries have identified agri-food systems as a risk, less than 15% of these actions are addressing the specific vulnerabilities, needs, capacities, and rights of different segments of the population. And we know that different segments of agri-food populations have different vulnerabilities and needs because the experience impacts disproportionately compared to other groups, right? Next slide, please. And just further to that point, if we look at the scale of adaptation actions in agri-food systems that are being designed, many are national and ecosystem-wide, which are, of course, appropriate in many contexts, but very few, 10%, are designed as local level measures, despite that we know that locally led adaptation is often more effective, more cost effective and sustainable in the long term, and of course, equitable. Next slide, please. This is the last section on findings, and it looks at the ways in which climate-related losses and damages were reported in the NAPs, taking in mind that NAPs were submitted from many years ago up until today. So the frequency in which these things are reported appear in the later NAPs as opposed to the earlier ones. Next slide, please. So here we see, and the report has more detail, this is just really a summary of when it comes to losses and damages being reported, 47% of countries are referring to losses and or damages in agri-food systems. And this is more frequent in terms of reporting than in any other sector. The losses and damages being reported are more often economic losses as opposed to non-economic losses. And this is, descriptions of loss of income, property, and infrastructure. Fewer around biodiversity, food security, human mobility, loss of life in agri-food systems. It's consistent with trends in other sectors and is likely due to methodological challenges in identifying those non-economic dimensions of loss, right, which aren't easily quantified, and speaks to the need for standardized methodologies, capacity building, etc. Another insight is that the impacts of losses and damages in agri-food systems being reported are more often reported as observed as opposed to projected compared to other sectors. So it's kind of a complicated sentence, but out of the mentions of losses and damages, the ones that are observed, the rate of mentions is higher than that compared to other sectors. And this may speak to the fact that the limits to adaptation are already being met in agri-food systems in some contexts, like in low-lying areas and small-scale agriculture, which is consistent with the IPCC findings. Another insight is that the losses and damages are often more linked to extreme weather events as opposed to slow onset events, the ones that are reported. So this, 64% of the mentions are related to extremes like floods and droughts, as opposed to slow onset events like sea level rise, desertification. And this again has to do likely with methodological and data challenges that contributing to this imbalance. Another insight is that the losses and damages mentioned are focused on production and not the full agri-food system, so mainly crop and livestock production as opposed to losses as they occur down the value chain, which becomes more difficult to track, but it also underestimates the full picture of loss and damage across the food system. And lastly, the agri-food losses and damage mentions are not as often monetized as they are in other sectors. So only 29% of loss and damage mentions for agri-food systems are associated with an economic cost, either in terms of USD or percent of GDP loss, compared to 83% of those mentions in other sectors, which were monetized. And I'll stop there in terms of the main findings. And just to wrap up, the report is, you'll see, organized and comes out in the context of 2025, which is when the LEG also has updated their NAP technical guidelines at this moment in which NAPs are to transition from planning documents to implementation, right? And the guidelines that the LEG has devised are to help guide you through that process. And we've structured, you'll see in the next slide and the one after, the conclusions from this analysis are structured around the different modules of the LEG guidance. And the reason for that is that we hope that the kind of insights and the gaps and the recommendations that are coming out from the agri-food system lens can guide practitioners when they transition from planning to NAP implementation. I think I'll stop there because I'm likely over time, but happy to answer any questions. And of course, here's the link to the publication itself with much more detail. And while just wanted to say that while the results are presented at the global level, there are supplementary data tables presenting the results at the regional level and for LDCs and SIDS. So thank you very much.
Excellent, Crystal. Thank you so much for walking us through the main findings of the report. I know that it was a lot of information to cover, but you really, I think, synthesized it really well. So we grasp, just how crucial agri-food systems are in NAPs, but also where there are some key gaps, especially when it comes to implementation, finance, loss and damage. So thank you for that. And thank you all for your attention. I think what we've decided here is that we've gone a little over time, and we have two great country speakers who've joined us today who will help us sort of think through, from their own country examples, how to transition from plans to implementation. And so for questions to Crystal, please do hold them. We'll take them at the very end, or you can also put them in the chat. And at this point, I would like to give the floor to Julie, who will be moderating the panel discussion with our country colleagues. So over to you, Julie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sybil, and thank you very much, Crystal, for this very comprehensive overview of this report. I'm very happy to now moderate the panel. We'll also be holding, as Sibyl said, we'll hold a Q&A after the panel discussion, so feel free to type the question and we'll take them all together. So on our panel today, who will be speaking about how they're moving from planning to implementation, we have Dr. Ismaël Koné, who's a climate change adaptation focal point for the National Climate Change Program of Côte d'Ivoire. He has over 5 years of experience in managing climate-related challenges, sustainable land management, and promoting resilient agriculture practices. And he's played a key role in the definition of priorities in the NDCs and the formulation of the NAP. We also have Mr. Jorge Gutierrez, who's Scala Colombia coordinator, and he's also leading FAO's Colombia's work on climate adaptation. And he co-led the climate and risk vulnerability assessment for Colombia's third national communication on climate change. And he's now speaking on behalf of the Sustainability and Climate Change Unit of the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development. So Colombia and Côte d'Ivoire are two of the countries that are part of the Scala program. And they have gone through the whole approach of moving from planning to implementation. So really look forward to hearing what they have to say about how they're addressing agri-food systems. So I'll start with Ismaël. My first question is to you. In your role with the National Climate Change Program of Côte d'Ivoire, you've been closely involved in the preparation of the National Adaptation Plans, which is now being finalized, and the NDC, which also was recently submitted. Could you tell us about the priorities that your country has identified for agriculture and food systems? And you could also explain how these priorities are reflected in Côte d'Ivoire's nationally determined contribution.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Hope you are all fine. Ismaël Koné from Côte d'Ivoire. It's a pleasure for me to be part of this nice event. Yeah, about the project of my country of the NAP. So, as you all know, Côte d'Ivoire is the first country in the world that produces cocoa. And agricultural sector is a pillar of Côte d'Ivoire GDP. That represents 20% of Côte d'Ivoire GDP. So, so far, you do have clear priority within this sector. However, I would like to highlight something that is very important. In Côte d'Ivoire NAP document, each sector is saturated in different thematics. For instance, the priority for agricultural sector is to support production from fishery, agropastoral, civico, and so on, so that they become more resilient about climate change. So to achieve this objective, you have three main axes. The first one is governance, knowledge, and awareness. For that, my country is trying to scale up index-based insurance initiative for agricultural climate change, because when climate change disasters occur, it's very difficult for farmers or producers to be maybe get money to refund this issue. We are working on rice production for this index-based insurance. The next production will be cotton. Close to that, we are trying to facilitate access to agricultural land for women and youth. The second component, we talk about climate resilient infrastructure, as you said previously. In the new NDC 3.0 that my country has submitted at the beginning of this month, you have 6 adaptation strategy. That's different for the previous one. For the NDC 2.0, adaptation strategy was 4. For that one, we are going to have 2 more adaptation strategy, because the NAP will take account climate resilience infrastructure that demonstrates NDC and NAP aligned for adaptation strategy. And the third one will be more focused about to support the implementation of a national climate smart agricultural strategy, also to promote good practice for climate change adaptation like greenhouse farming, agroecologic, and agroforestry too. That's what my country are doing so far about agricultural priority in the NAP.
Thank you very much, Ismaël. It's really good to hear about the priorities and some of the actions, including some innovative one like the index-based insurance. Now I will turn to Jorge. Let's hear about Colombia. Colombia has submitted a very ambitious NAP in 2021. And this is now under implementation. And actually, this was partly formulated with the support of the NAP-AG program, which was also supported by Germany. And the NAP places agri-food systems at the center of adaptation to climate change. Could you describe for us the priorities that you have identified in terms of agri-food systems and how those are also reflected in the NDC that you recently submitted? Thank you.
Thank you, Julian, for all the organizers. In Colombia, on behalf of the Ministry of Agriculture, we conceived climate action in agri-food systems as part of a just and territorial transition. Now we are in line with the comprehensive rural reform that is taking place now and the current government's vision of a world power of life. Since 2021, like you say, priorities has been consolidated into 5 pillars. One of those, in our case, is the agroclimatic risks management and access to information. Two agroclimatic technical tables, that is a very interesting platform in our territories, and climate services for productive decision making. Other one is the sustainable and low carbon practices such as silvopastoral system, agroforestry, and agroecology with strengthened peasant, ethnic, and community economies. Other one and very important in our case is the ecosystem-based adaptation and nature-based solution to protect the paramos. That is a very in vulnerability ecosystem, wetlands too, and water supply and basins. Other important pillar for us is the productive reconversion and rural bioeconomy, linking innovation, local knowledge, and sustainable value chains. And finally, access to climate finance and the inclusive markets to close technological gaps for ensure territorial equity. Then, these priorities we reflected in the new NDC 3.0 with the very concrete targets, such as emission reduction between 155 and 161 megatons of CO2 equivalents by 2035, with 3.6 million of hectares in silvopastoral systems and expanded agroforestry. Other very important axis for us is the control of the deforestation, especially in the Amazon forest. We try to reduce to less than 50,000 hectares by year by the 2030, and we intend a restoration of 1 million of hectares in the Amazon. Other one NDC 3.0 target is the focus on for food security and productive resilience, aligned with the global goal on adaptation in discussion in this COP, and the develop of the loss and damage evaluation system, which has been included as one of the additional measures proposed in this new NDC 3.0. In this way, for us in Colombia, the climate action in agriculture is not only technical way, no, it is a social and political. We think that it seeks to ensure for sovereignty, reducing inequalities and building territorial peace. You know that Colombia is in the last 60 years in war, affecting the vulnerability in social roots, placing then peasants, indigenous people, and Afro-descendant communities as the center and protagonists of this transformation in this government. Julie, thank you and colleagues.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think you made some very important points and reinforced what Crystal was saying about the importance of localizing, the importance of equity and social inclusion, the fact that ecosystem-based adaptation is also a key part of the solution, the other point you were making about the alignment with the NDCs and the synergy between mitigation and adaptation, as well as inclusion of loss and damage. So it's a very good echo to what was presented in the analysis. With this, I will move to the round two of questions. So I turn back to Ismail. So now that you have all those priorities outlined in your NAP and your NDC, what do you need to move from these plans to transformative action on the ground? And can you tell us a little bit about some concrete steps that you have already undertaken?
Yes, thank you very much once again. So as a developing country, the first thing that my country needs currently is fund, is money. You are trying to mobilize the financial tools and follow public and private sector to implement adaptation strategy. Also, you need reforestation or marketable project in the adaptation sector to reinforce coordination between land ministry. That's also very important. Also, capacity building for civil servants, grassroots actors, and stakeholders. That's my country need currently. The first thing is to mobilize funds to implement some project for adaptation climate change. So the step that is already taken by Cote d'Ivoire, there's a good news. The good news is that the NAP was adopted by the Climate Commission. In Cote d'Ivoire, there's commission. Before this NAP will go to the Council of Ministry, it has first of all to be adopted by this commission. It's already done. And the next step, this Cote d'Ivoire NAP will forward to the President of the Republic so that at the end of this month, you go forward to the click. And you also implement a big project, even northern part of Cote d'Ivoire, is about photovoltaic renewable central project. Also, our project about early warning system is adopted by the IFDB. That's the good news. We have already establishment a national measurement reporting and verification MLV system for adoption strategy in Cote d'Ivoire. A Cote d'Ivoire government has adopted two big laws, a law for the real markets, a law for the transition taxonomy. You know, real markets is used to track climate finance flow and assess how development country contribute to climate adaptation and mitigation. A transition taxonomy is first of all, to provide a framework to classify economic activity to avoid green washing. This is a small step that my country has already done in the process of NAP. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for outlining some of the key barriers to implementation, and of course, especially the financing part. And that also echoes what Crystal was mentioning about the fact that Agrifood Systems requires about 50% of adaptation finance overall, but at the moment they're only receiving 20%, and there's a really big need to scale up. I also like the last point you were making about the need for an enabling framework that really frames how private sector can also be engaged and scale up implementation of adaptation and climate action in general. So the last question now will go to Jorge. Can you also tell us how Colombia has been implementing its NAP sectoral priorities? And you already mentioned that like localized approach. So if you could put a bit more emphasis on this and how you're going to local communities and also using indigenous knowledge and really building adaptation from the ground up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. In our case, Colombia has adopted a comprehensive territorial and participatory approach in the implementation of the sectoral priorities and the national adaptation plan in line with the comprehensive rural reform and the current government's vision of just transition. We have, in this sense, three pillars. One of those, territorialization and multi-level governance. Our priorities are implemented through sectoral and territorial comprehensive climate change management plan, PIC in our case, coordinated with the regional climate change nodes and local authorities. This is a very interesting approach in our territories. We have more than 15 of those nodes. This ensures that measures respond to the agroclimatic and social realities of each region, because you know that in our geography there is a lot of diversity, and this approach is helping for us. Second one is community participation and differential approach. In this way, the inclusion of peasant, indigenous people, and Afro-descendant communities as central actors is promoted, integrating their knowledge into planning and implementation. Again, the agroclimatical technical tables serve as key spaces to co-design with the the people, with the community, and with the local governments, adaptive solutions and strengthen local capacities. In our case, there is two very good examples that is represented in the generation of a joint framework FAO, where we co-designed a certification of agriculture adapted to climate change, very innovative framework. And the other hand, we understand the relevance of traditional knowledge in strengthening adaptive pathways. For this reason, we will publish in the next months a very interesting text called The House of Adaptation, where we collect adaptive practices based in the traditional knowledge for our five regions in the country. And finally, innovation and climate justice is the last one of our pillars in the country. Here, the government and the local government promotes agroecology, productive diversification, and rural bioeconomy, alongside climate finance mechanism and agricultural digitalization. That is a very innovative approach too in our country. Closing technological gaps for ensure territorial inequity. In the context for a Scala project, for example, we become together an essential collaboration platform to translate these climate agri-food priorities and commitment into practice, no, in the local territories by strengthening the evidence base, developing capacities, and fostering coordination among sectoral, private, and sectoral actors. In this way, Scala project contribute to catalyze effective and coherent climate action in the vertical coherent, no, facilitating the implementation of NAPs at the territorial level. One interesting, two interesting examples now is the implementation in La Mojana in the Caribbean and in Guajira in the north of Colombia with agroforestry systems and water management practices that have been implemented, adapted to drought and flood scenarios. Now, Colombia is suffering all the years or between 2 or 3 years, one El Niño phenomenon and one La Niña, as well as the specific risk and vulnerability of each region, combining scientific knowledge with ancestral practices. Then in this way, the implementation is not, again, only technical. We try to connect the social and the political dialogue in the territories. It aims to ensure our foreignly reducing vulnerabilities and building territorial peace in the framework of this territory in Colombia.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ismael. Thank you, Jorge. It's been very interesting to hear your insights and how you're considering different approaches and you're translating your high-level commitments from your NAPs and NDCs into transformative action on the ground. And it's also really good to hear of some of the solutions and also the fact that you're working at different level in the specific agri-food systems sectors at the regional and local levels as well. So with that, I would like to open the floor to all participants. As a reminder, you can ask questions both to Crystal on the NAP analysis and to our panelists to get more of their experience from their countries. And if you are joining from the Maloka platform, you can also write your question on the platform, and our colleagues who are in the Maloka platform can also send us the questions. So you can raise your hand, type your question in the chat, in the Q&A. Maybe to kickstart, Crystal, do you have questions to Colombia and Côte d'Ivoire that relate to how the NAP analysis can apply to their countries or vice versa? I see a question from Gwyn Foster from South Africa.
Ah, okay.
Thank you very much. One of the, just to position where I'm coming from, I specialize in market access and traceability in particular, and the data obviously is cross-cutting. The climate requirements have taken data recording down to ground level, if I can put it that way. So if we get into the carbon economy, if we have a look, and there was reference to the concern about agriculture perhaps clashing with biodiversity, we get a lot of that. Is there any particular standard that is favored for identifying the location where data is recorded? And here I'm thinking upstream, if you like, before the first point of commercial entry, if we're looking at a food supply chain. So at farm level, with the inputs, if we're spraying, are there any standards that are favored for identifying the location where there is an activity when the related data contributes to the overall picture?
I think this is a question to all, but so any of you would like to answer this? And it might be also more specific to Crystal, perhaps.
I'm also happy to take the discussion offline. And one of the concerns generally, if I look at market access, is the greenwashing. How do you authenticate? At the end of the day, it comes down to the authenticity of the data that is used in recording and the responses to any of the surveys. Thanks.
I can respond, with respect to the NAP analysis, but I don't think I'll directly respond to that question. If we had any of the private sector Scala experts online, perhaps they could chime in on the question of accountability, transparency, greenwashing, those sorts of questions. Within the NAP analysis, particularly, we see less data available with respect to downstream agri-food activities and climate impacts on different nodes of the value chain downstream. But I think your question is different and isn't really about the content of the NAP, is it? So maybe if any of the country speakers have their experiences, or any of the Scala private sector experts on the call could come in.
Don't worry, we needn't interrupt now. I have in the past, if we go back to food safety, I did work with FAO, and it really comes down to what is the data. Yes, you've got the policies, and policies are changing, standards are changing, but it comes down to how do we measure the national, how is the data that is submitted verified on a national basis and taken down to the lack of data, which obviously we need to close. So there are skills, there's everything else. But thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Actually, under Scala, we've conducted some studies related to private sector engagement, and this issue of traceability is actually one that came up as one of the highest in the few countries that we looked at, in Côte d'Ivoire including, but I don't know if Dr. Kone, you're familiar with this work. I know in Cambodia as well, where we're working on the cashew and cassava value chains, increased traceability is also one of the key actions that we're going to be supporting in the next phase. I also see online our colleague Paolo Prosper from FAO, who is one of the MRV experts and who might also want to come in. If you can hear me.
Yeah, I was trying to unmute myself.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for looping me in. I actually was writing a question in a Q&A box because my interest is towards the alignment of NAPs and NDCs when it comes to various issues, and of course adaptation is one of them, or vice versa, alignment of NDCs with NAPs, depending on the times when these two, say, rather technical but also political documents have been put forward by the countries. If you can elaborate on that based upon the results of the analysis. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, so I guess we'll follow up with that, Mrs. Foster, if you want to email us, and we can talk a bit more about the issue of traceability and avoiding greenwashing, and we can move to some other questions. So Paolo was asking about the alignment.
Absolutely. Thanks.
If Ismael or Jorge, you want to talk about the alignment, which you've briefly touched upon in your presentation.
Okay, let me start. As I said earlier during my presentation, in the previous NDC Côte d'Ivoire, NDC 2.0, there were 4 adaptation strategies. And in the new version of NDC 3.0, there are 6 adaptation strategies because the NAP has taken account climate resilient infrastructure and green city too. This demonstrates that the NDC and the NAP are aligned. This is the true innovation for the new NDC because the previous one, 2.0, there was 4 adaptation strategy, and the new one, 3.0, we add 2 more because this 2 more is from the Côte d'Ivoire NAPs. That shows the alignment with the NDC 3.0 and the new version of the Côte d'Ivoire NAPs.
Thank you very much. Jorge, do you want to respond as well?
Yeah, only 2 lines about the question. Thank you. In Colombia, we consider that is a very interesting transition between NDC 2.0 and 3.0 in the way of the ambition and exactly alignment with the NAP. For Colombia, the NAP participation when was built was important for private sector, for example. And now in the new version of 3.0, we have more participation not only for private sector and more for the local communities and these visions. We think that is maybe better for guarantee of the new commitments and the dialogue between goal in of 2.0 and 3.0. Then we consider that this kind of alignment will be important for the new goals because the participation.
Thank you. While I have you, actually, we had another question on the role of indigenous people and traditional knowledge. You mentioned it as well in your talking points, but if you could elaborate a bit on the methodology that you adopted and which was implemented through Scala to elicit and make sure that this knowledge was captured and reflected in adaptation plans and in the implementation. Thank you.
Yeah, in Colombia we have 63 different kinds of communities of indigenous people, but not only the indigenous people have a local knowledge. When we design with the ministry and develop the local implementation with the Scala project, we think that is possible to put into a better place for better visibilization the practices, no, the local practices for the communities, and we understand and we are finding very ancient practices that help with or without visibilization that is possible to adapting to climate change. But in the Scala project, we focus in the local knowledge, and we have a very interesting case in the north of Colombia with the Wayuu communities. That is a community that is matrilineal. No, we have in this community gender approach and indigenous knowledge, and together we build the planning and models for producing food with the sustainable way and adapting lines go into the future of the adapting practices and pathway. The community now, in difference, when we begin the project, now have excellence, for example, in food, understand the manage of the water, the soil, and the local seeds with the Guajiro bean, for example. Then this local case is possible to expand it to another communities and share the possibility to find a solution for the vulnerability in climate change, into climate change.
Thank you very much. We have 2 minutes left. Unfortunately, we had quite a few other questions. We had some questions from participants from Zambia, I assume. Please reach out to us. Maybe we can follow up. We actually have supported a small study in Zambia, which is looking into the feasibility of some ecosystem-based adaptation and how to scale it up in Zambia. So we can follow up on that. We had some really good examples shared also by a colleague from Bangladesh. And I think with that, we need to start closing the event. So I will pass the floor back to Sibyl. Thank you very much again, Ismael and Jorge, for sharing your experience.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you all of you for joining us today. I think this was a bit of an experiment using this COP virtual platform, and I think it's gone well. So thank you for joining us on this trial, and it was a pleasure. We had people joining us all the way from Mongolia to Colombia and everywhere in between. So excellent global event, and I think just to say a couple of words, first of all, thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to Dr. Yekel for his opening remarks and for framing the discussion. Thank you to Crystal for sharing the results of the NAP analysis. And thank you to also Ismael and Jorge for sharing your country experiences, which I think really helped us to start to see, all of these findings about trends in agri-food systems and NAPs. What does that really mean at country level, right? How do we bridge what countries are committing to within the international space into how do we bridge that into national action? And we heard some great insights on what are the barriers still being faced with regards to, institutional barriers, financial barriers, but also what are some ways that implementation is really happening with, participation of local communities, with innovative approaches to insurance, et cetera. So thank you for this. It's part of a conversation. We look forward to other opportunities to engage with you. And as you can see on your screen, you can see the QR code to the report, which has a lot more findings. Agri-food systems are a priority across all NAPs. All agri-food subsectors are priority target actions in the NAPs. But there are some gaps to fill, and FAO and UNDP remained committed to supporting countries. So let me just say, Julie, do you have any other final words to close today's session? And I'll just say thanks again to everyone.
Bye. We're enjoying your program, our program. This is a very nice program.
Oh, sorry, I realized I was on mute. Thank you very much for your comment. Thanks to the participants. Thank you to the panelists. And please go on our website and download this publication and reach out to us if you have any questions. And enjoy the rest of the COP in person or virtually.